Dr. Conrod, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining the third episode of the Grow Your Growth podcast. I've never won the lottery, but having you here today, this morning, I think I know what it feels like because we've been going back and forth trying to have this conversation, and now we're here. So I'm really happy you took some time out of your morning, your busy schedule to talk to me this morning.
Oh, I know. It's a pleasure being here. And as I just said, I apologize for it being so difficult to pin me down, but I really do, believe in your concept and what you're trying to do. So it's a pleasure to be here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So, Dr. Conrod, one of your titles is you're the professor in the Department of Psychiatry at l'UDM, so Université de Montréal. Can you talk to me about what you do in this role and how long you've been in it?
Sure. I am trained as a clinical psychologist, but I joined the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Montreal in 2010, then helped it to transition to the Department of Psychiatry and Addictologie a couple of years later, in recognition of the importance and the relationship between mental health and substance use problems, but also in recognition of, a lot of strengths in addiction research at University of Montreal, which I contribute to. So that's an area of expertise of my own.
Before I get into exactly your work, I just want to talk to you about maybe the psychiatry aspect. Why was it important for you to dive into that?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So trained as a psychologist, and my previous positions had been in psychology departments at Stony Brook University in the US, at University of British Columbia in Canada. And I moved over to psychiatry departments just because the positions allowed me to focus a little bit more of my time on research. Although I do miss the teaching and interacting with undergrads that tend to come with being in a psychology department. These positions were just in research centers that had very high productivity resources, and my work was going in a direction that required a lot more time and energy and resources. And so I just made a decision at some point that I would focus, all of my time on research and disseminating knowledge that we get from research, particularly, the research on how to prevent mental health and substance use problems. So that takes up a lot of my time, and everyone seems to be happy with me doing more of that than teaching necessarily.
I want to touch on that because it's a very important topic, especially in society right now. You're also director of what you mentioned, the Neuroscience Department of Mental Health at l'UDM, which is exactly, when I was scrolling on LinkedIn, I saw your profile. I'm like, this is very engaging and this is important information. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you. So I'm on this journey to talk about mental health, have open discussions about mental health, and experts like yourself who are doing the work maybe can deepen that knowledge. So when we're getting into talking about mental health and the brain, Dr. Conrod, what's important in the relationship between the brain and mental health?
Yeah, absolutely. So briefly, the strategy for neuroscience and mental health at the University of Montreal, SANSUM, is a new strategy that is designed to help all the different researchers in this very diverse community to find each other, to come together, to facilitate more impactful research where experts on the basic neuroscience of the brain and how it works can more easily interact with people who are doing clinical intervention or even population and policy level work. And so we as a collective believe that that's the way in which our work will be more impactful, will be more likely to be translated to broad solutions, because we need them. We need them in society. It's become very clear that the mental health needs of the population exceed the resources available to address them right now. And the other thing what's guided me more towards developmental neuroscience and focusing on children and the developing brain is that it's become very clear from research, epidemiologic research, but also some basic neuroscience as well as longitudinal research, that there are developmental origins to mental health concerns. And the more we understand those, the more we can develop interventions that can be delivered earlier before people suffer from some of the harms from mental health problems. A few things we know. They're highly prevalent. The majority of people who suffer from mental health difficulties report that the first symptom onset happens in the adolescent, young adulthood period. And these symptoms exist on a continuum, and they overlap with some of the kind of the natural variation that we see in human society around personality, around how people react to stress, how they react to emotions, how they react to novelty. And it turns out, those individual differences map onto how we understand how the brain works and responds to its environment. So you see, it all exists on a continuum. And that's why we're trying to put basic neuroscientists together with people who study personality and creativity and as well as people who study how treatments work. But the idea is that risk exists on a continuum, and you can identify psychological traits in young people, even in children, that will predict how they respond to stress and how they will respond to different types of environments and triggers. And you can help a young person manage how they respond to those things, and you can help a young person manage those individual differences. Good parenting, good mentoring, peer environments, good education, strong socialization, and instilling confidence, hope, encouragement, and having outlets for those individual differences. So we know that from research. And nevertheless, those individual differences tend to be somewhat stable, not perfectly stable, but somewhat stable, in that when a person is stressed, you can predict how their stress is going to manifest itself. Someone who's more prone to experience symptoms of anxiety as a child over the course of adolescence and young adulthood, if things get really difficult, or if the environment is, mismatches the person's capacity to cope, they're more likely to experience anxiety associated with that event. By contrast, a young person who has more externalizing tendencies, who's prone to more acting out, impulsivity, even just gregariousness, when they are challenged, traumatized, stressed, mistreated, their distress manifests itself in a different way, and it's along the more externalizing dimension. So not that they're in any less distress, but the way it comes out is different. And it turns out there are gender and sex differences as well, right? In how these traits exist in people, and then how these kinds of traits influence behavior and the development of mental health problems. So you add all of these different risk factors together, and that's how we understand someone being tipped over to the more problematic spectrum of problems.
Absolutely.
So my research, for example, has demonstrated that to be quite the case with respect to cannabis. Okay, so you have these individual differences. You even have a number of genetic risk factors for psychosis. There are some childhood psychological risk factors for psychosis. There are also environmental risk factors for psychosis, such as living in an urban environment and also being a visible minority and having a recent history of immigration, right? So all of these things have additive effects on someone's risk for transitioning to psychosis. Well, so does cannabis use, and it's a small effect, but it doesn't affect everyone. But if you add that to a number of other risk factors, what you see is that you cannabis can tip somebody over into risk for developing a very severe problem with psychosis. Doesn't do it for everyone, but if you put that alongside all of these other additive risk factors, suddenly it can have a very detrimental effect for someone's outcome. So when we start to think about what we can do about it, we need to address all of the risk factors, right? We need to reduce the impact. We have to understand how these, just because something's a risk factor doesn't mean it's causal. It might just be reflecting some underlying process. But so we need to understand risk. Why is it making people more at risk of transitioning? And then design interventions that will reduce these additive risk factors. So that means there's not just one thing to do. There's multiple things that we need to do in order to reduce risk for mental health problems in the population.
Thank you so much for that answer, Dr. Conrod. I want to also touch on that study that you contributed to, which is the screen time and the effects on behavior when it comes to teens. Just talk to me about, what your findings were, and were you maybe shocked to see how much this is impacting teens' mental health?
Yeah, I was, because this study was designed actually quite a long time ago. So the study was designed in 2000, 11, 12. So if you think back to 2011, 10, 11, 12, it was actually designed in 2010. Social media for young people was not on anyone's radar. Back then, everyone was like, Facebook is for adults, and young people will never use Facebook. It's not an issue. And the bigger issue was video gaming. Back then, I was a parent at the time, and still am, but parent of a young person at the time, and on everyone's radar was the worries about the sophisticated video games that began to involve some interaction, like peer interaction, and quite violent content. So we launched a study that was actually designed to evaluate the effects of alcohol, of teen drinking behavior on neuropsychological or cognitive development and brain development. So it had both a neuropsychological component and a neuroimaging component to it. And this study is an epidemiologically representative sample of teenagers living in Montreal at that time. And they were assessed every year for 5 years. It was a very large cohort where we partnered with schools, and the schools, with young people's consent, allowed us to survey and evaluate the whole grade every year throughout the course of their experience in secondary school. And so some of your listeners might actually have been participants, and I thank them for their participation. So at the time we said, listen, let's, while we're doing this, let's also evaluate other health behaviors, like how much other substances young people are using, how much exercise they're getting, what about their video gaming, and why not evaluate that against, how much time they spend in front of other screens like computers. And luckily, we threw a few questions in about how much time are you also spending on social media, and we gave some examples like Instagram, Facebook, etc. And 2012, the smartphone came out, and suddenly, social media took off for young people. And I think most adults still believe that young people would not be engaging on these platforms. And it was very unmonitored. I don't think many people knew really what was happening with young people at the time. So we followed the cohort, and we did some analyses to try to understand how video gaming, social media, computer use, and television use compare to each other in terms of impact on youth mental health. And our very first study showed that social media, compared to any of these other screen time activities, was having a very negative effect on youth depression outcomes. And that study was published early on, and very early on, recognized by Business Insider as having stimulated some of the work that some of the experimental work that Instagram and Facebook were doing, in the sense that in Canada and Australia, they began to start to experiment with different social influence features of their platform to see how it might affect young people. So that's documented in the press. And then we continue to do the work. It was a very widely covered study. I ended up on CNN talking about the study because it was just,
congratulations,
very quickly had become huge concern to society. And there was very little research on the topic. And so we looked at the effects of different forms of screen time on anxiety, on eating disorder symptoms, on ADHD symptoms and cognitive development, as well as on aggressive behaviors. The big picture is that more than all the other forms of digital media, social media seems to have a stronger relationship, negative impact on young people's mental health across all those indicators. We didn't find any big striking evidence that there were gender differences, but we have to look into it more, I'd say. And the way in which it seems to be impacting young people's mental health is like 3 or 4-fold. So the first is, it has nothing to do with how little exercise they get. Okay, we tested that hypothesis. It's not about sedentary behavior. It seems to promote problematic social norms. Okay, so young people seem to be, so some young, through social media relative to other forms of media, they seem to be developing expectations about themselves and the world that are biased and that contribute to more significant depression symptoms. And the bigger one is that they seem to come to believe that it's more normal to be an underage drinker and to be an underage cannabis user. And those problematic social norms do predict who will become an early onset drinker and substance user. So you see what I mean? Like they're being exposed to content that's not edited, that's shared by their peers, and that has a lot of influence on them, that's liked by people, and that's biased because I guess young people are sharing a lot of content that, is aligned with only some messages and not all of, the real reality of the situation for a young person.
Absolutely.
You don't share information about when you're not feeling so well. You share pictures about parties and having fun and looking good. And that makes young people believe that others are having more fun, look better, and are more successful from them. And then, it's influencing self-esteem, and it's influencing how they construct social norms and their world. The second thing or third thing that we discovered is that it's also impacting the development of cognitive control. So the more you spend time on social media, the less you develop inhibitory control. And it's a very important cognitive process that develops over the course of late adolescence that's essential to kind of mature decision making. It's a skill that's developed through practice and socialization. And we're not entirely sure why social media is impacting that particular cognitive process more than other forms of media. But my guess is that there's just very little cognitive control needed to engage in social media. It's a very passive event. And even if you were to compare that to television, for example, television involves at least having to follow a narrative. There's a story to it, and you have to kind of engage with a character and follow a narrative. Whereas in social media, you just kind of flip through images and you don't necessarily fully process the messages that are exposed to you because it's just you're exposed to things so quickly. And so what we think is happening is that young people are just spending a lot of time engaging in activities that are not allowing them to practice the development of this essential skill, which is cognitive control. Like how do you engage and train your brain to think something through that's difficult, follow a plot, think more deeply about, character development, for example, which is what you would get from television or watching a film. And then, even compared to video games involve having to more actively interact with content and exert inhibitory control, right? You have to sometimes not react, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I wanted to add, Dr. Conrod, you mentioned policy makers when you were talking about your findings or studies. I don't know if you can answer this question, but how do you suggest through that research that we tackle some of the issues that you are seeing or noticing come out in this research?
Well, I know I'm being long-winded. There's another feature to social media that we
go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, and which relates to your question, and the other feature is this reinforcing spiral. So the really potentially harmful part of it is that it's having potentially these effects, which then combined with these reinforcing spirals, and that is the more you look at something or selectively view or share content, the more likely you will be fed that kind of content. And the commercialization process has really accelerated those algorithms, and they're not transparent. They're not transparent to parents. They're not transparent to kids. They're not even transparent to policymakers right now. And so to get to your last question, the risk there is that young people get caught up in a reinforcing spiral that they don't even know about, and that we know is also dangerous. So, for policymakers, I'm not an expert on the subject, but I have dabbled in it a little bit, and I've spoken to people who have been central in bringing and passing new bills and policies in the UK and Europe, in the US and in Canada. And each jurisdiction is taking a different approach. And I really like the European approach and the UK approach, although they've had some challenges. And that is, so you can either kind of restrict practices, you can either, regulate and restrict practices, but then you get into this argument of, you're restricting free speech and, platforms that allow for free speech or promote free speech. The approach that they've taken in Europe and the UK is to focus on safety of children. And they've really focused on child acts and children's acts, and that all have the same principle to them. And that is that if a product developer or service is interacting with young people, knows that they're interacting with young people, they have a duty to design their products to be safe for vulnerable and young people. And so this has led, just putting the onus on industry to protect young people with the recognition that their products are being used by young people. So under the Child Act, you have this responsibility to protect children as they interact with your product. And I think that's the way to go, at least with respect to, protecting young people. There are harms to other people, but I mean, we know that young people are being solicited by strangers, by perpetrators, and it's really important that government put pressure on industry to take the responsibility of reducing those harms. And what we know from, the Facebook files is that they haven't really done that. And they've, even, with the knowledge that their products were having an impact on young people, they still didn't do it. And so, at what point are we going? I mean, if you think of it, it's remarkable that we don't have better regulation of these digital products that people are using hours and hours and hours and hours every day.
I do want to get to a point that you mentioned in one of your answers when you were talking about mental disorders, and we spoke about that during our conversation in the summer. You kind of spoke about ADHD, mental health, and also how that impacts gender differently. So I'd love for you to maybe tackle that a bit more. And what are you noticing in your research?
Yeah. So, very widely documented effect is women are more prone or more likely to be diagnosed with depression. Boys are much more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, attention deficit and hyperactivity. And both are psychiatric diagnoses that are recognized as being heterogeneous, not being a unitary condition. So there's a lot that we don't understand about them. But there are clear sex and gender differences in who's at risk for them. So talking about ADHD, I mean, it's a problem for girls, but it is a bigger problem for boys, for sure. And we need to get better at offering resources to young kids with ADHD. There are medications that are available and they're helpful.
Because it's that bad?
Well, why is it bad? That's a good question. So why is it bad? There is no denying the literature that ADHD is a risk factor for conduct disorder, so antisocial behaviors, and it's a risk factor for substance use problems. But why? Why is it? Okay. I think that there is something to the condition that is implicated in risk for addiction, and that is this tendency to have impulsivity, like to have poor cognitive and behavioral control. So the difficulty in just saying no or putting a stop to a behavior once you've started it. Okay? So it's as simple as that. And that is core to ADHD symptoms, but it's also very much involved in risk for substance use. But like I said, going back to this kind of additive concept, that trait doesn't necessarily have to lead to substance use problems. And in fact, that trait could also contribute to very pro-social risk-taking behavior. So, people with that trait also tend to be journalists, and engage in certain types of professions that require you to take risks. It's a trait, impulsivity is a trait that exists in every culture. And it's a trait that has a mild genetic component to it, but it has a strong environmental component to it. I believe it's an important trait for society. You need risk takers. You need people who are willing to be out there and not to be inhibited when they're faced with danger. It's up to society to help channel that trait towards things that are helpful in society. And, I think that there's signs right now that the way in which we're managing ADHD, or that individual difference that's more observed in boys and girls, is not being managed very well. We keep requiring young people to sit in a classroom for 8 hours a day. Every year, we're taking away more time from physical education, the resources that allow young people to take field trips or just, walk up to the mountain and learn out there in the environment. So I think that we need to think a little bit more about how that trait interacts with formal education and offer young people with neurodiversity other ways of learning. We need to do research on it. We need to, so it's not just, hey, this is a good idea, let's do this. It's, hey, this is a full idea that's based on science and let's make sure it works, right? What we do know is that if ADHD occurs with school disengagement and poor academic outcomes. So if things go wrong at school for a child with ADHD, it's more likely to transition to conduct problems, so rule breaking, and then antisocial problems and substance use disorder. So it's really critical that we make the kind of late childhood, early adolescent transition smooth, that we instill confidence in young people with ADHD, that we offer them resources. We know that coaching, tutoring, and medication, as well as other psychological interventions and peer support, all of those things can be extremely helpful, but the resources need to be dedicated toward them.
Yeah. I want to stick on substance disorders just for a bit, if you would let me, Dr. Conrod. By the age of 40, nearly 50% of Canadians will have suffered from a mental illness. I understand your work is also, related to finding new approaches to treatment. This may be a question, very vague question, but let me know if it's too vague. So what types of new approaches? So what could you say about the different mental disorders and how much people are getting the right care to treat them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, your questions are awesome, John.
Listen,
You've done your research.
I really wanted to have you today, and I wanted to make sure that the questions bring out the best out of you, because I really respect your work.
Yeah. So a few things. So
Okay.
I just spoke about this yesterday when we 2 days ago when we launched a new pediatric brain imaging center at Saint-Justine. In about 2013, as you said, Statistics Canada published a report that highlighted just the prevalence of mental health problems in Canadian society, almost for the first time, but also highlighted how many people who suffer from mental health problems had been suffering from them for many years and had reported that their symptoms began during adolescence.
Like you mentioned, yeah.
And then this statistic that, by the age of 40, one in 5 people will have experienced a mental health or substance use disorder. And so the scale of the problem was unexpected. And it became clear that the systems that we currently have to address mental health problems are not designed to address just the amount of risk in the population or the fact that actually people are suffering at a much earlier age. So our mental health systems were designed for adults with acute mental health problems. And so since that report, researchers, policymakers, and clinics to some extent have been trying to adjust to the reality, which is young people need more support. We need earlier interventions, briefer ones, and interventions available to people at multiple stages in the course of their development in their lives, probably at some of the major milestones as they go through these big transitions to high school, to primary school, to high school, to independent living or university, into marriage or relationships, for example. So employment. So we need mental health resources across the lifespan for the population. And those aren't accessible right now. And that's what people are, in my world, are really trying to fix. We're trying to put a lot of pressure on government to make these resources that actually are a lot cheaper to deliver in brief forms early on than they would be downstream when things get really complicated and so on. One last statistic I'll share with you. We do know this for depression and for substance use disorders, is that so they're very prevalent in the population, and yet depending on the study, it's only between like 5 and 15% of the population who suffers from one of those two conditions actually ever receives treatment in their lifetime. So it's very undertreated. And of those who do get treatment, the average individual will report suffering about a decade of harm before they ever get treatment. So it's undertreated and it's treated too late. And the nice thing is that there are some initiatives at the federal level and provincial levels across the country where we are trying to kind of shift resources upstream in order
what does that look like?
offer resources. And so that's the work that I do is, basically repackaging some of the treatments you would get if you were suffering from clinically significant levels of depression or conduct problems or anxiety or substance use problems, and deliver it earlier on and even preventatively. And as such, it can be briefer. It can be a more positive conversation. A person can have a lot more choice. There's a lot less kind of crisis in the conversation. The conversation can be very kind of exploratory and exciting for the individual because they're focusing on what's unique about them, what their strengths, and where they want to go in life. So you're actually empowering someone with a little bit more knowledge about themselves, the skills that could be, coping skills that could be helpful for their particular trait, for example. So if you're someone who's prone to impulsivity or risk-taking, what do you need to know about how to manage that and how to channel that towards success? Rather than saying, you're someone who's prone to impulsivity, you're bad, and you will always be bad. Which is the message that is the message for a young person with impulse control problems in schools right now. There's even studies on that say that a young person before they even get to school is reprimanded like 20 times before they get to school because their impulse control problems just, require people to discipline them a little bit more. And often it's negative and it makes a young person feel terrible. So I have an enormous amount of empathy towards someone who struggles with impulse control problems. It's a very punishing world. And if you think about it that way, you can understand how a young person with impulsivity, with impulse control problems, starts to develop kind of hostile attributions or this kind of hostile or tough exterior to them. Their world is more punishing than how other people experience their worlds. They get a lot of negative feedback.
Yeah, it's really, like you mentioned, about changing the approach and giving more ownership and more, like you said, empowerment to somebody in those situations. Dr. Conrod, I'm so happy we spoke today. I initially wanted to speak to you for 20 minutes, but we've definitely gone over that.
We sure have. It was a lovely conversation and great questions. It was a real pleasure, John. Hope to do it again.
Yeah, I hope to. Well, I will follow you, so I'll keep messaging you if I find some interesting information. Thank you again for the time, and I'm just very grateful that we had this conversation.
Me too.
Really appreciate it.
Good luck with your podcast.
Yes.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.